In the vast expanse of the galaxy, nestled on the edge of a distant star system, lay the planet Eloria, a world of breathtaking beauty and ancient wisdom. From its towering crystal spires to its endless fields of bioluminescent flora, Eloria was a planet where technology and nature coexisted in perfect harmony. But beneath the serene surface of this advanced civilization, a crisis was brewing, one that threatened to unravel the very fabric of their existence. High above the planet's surface, in the orbiting research station known as Solara, a young woman stood alone in the observation deck, her gaze fixed on the planet below. Xenia's silver-blue skin shimmered in the soft glow of the station's lights, her violet eyes filled with a mixture of determination and dread. She was one of Eloria's most brilliant minds, a scientist whose understanding of energy systems was unmatched. But now even her vast knowledge was being tested to its limits. Eloria's energy network, the lifeblood of the planet, was failing. Designed by their ancestors millennia ago, this intricate system harnessed cosmic energy to power everything from the city's floating platforms to the protective fields that shielded them from the planet's harsh environment. But over the past few years, the network had begun to show signs of deterioration. Energy fluctuations became more frequent, power outages spread across entire regions, and the once stable protective fields flickered ominously. Despite the best efforts of Eloria's top scientists, including Xenia herself, they had been unable to identify the root cause of the failure. The ancient system was simply too complex, its design too advanced for even the brightest minds of the current generation to fully comprehend. And now time was running out. If the energy network collapsed entirely, Eloria would be plunged into chaos, its people left vulnerable to the planet's volatile storms and unpredictable seismic activity. Xenia's thoughts were interrupted by a soft chime, signaling an incoming message. She turned away from the observation deck, her heart heavy with the weight of the responsibility she bore. As she approached the console, the holographic display flickered to life, revealing the face of the head counselor. Xenia, the head counselor's voice was calm, but Xenia could hear the underlying tension. The situation is deteriorating faster than we anticipated. The council has reviewed your latest report, and we agree there's only one course of action left. Xenia's breath caught in her throat. She knew what the counselor was about to say, but hearing the words out loud made it all too real. We must retrieve the knowledge from Earth, the counselor continued. There is no other way to stabilize the network. You are the only one who can do this. You understand the gravity of the situation better than anyone. Xenia nodded, her mind already racing through the logistics of what needed to be done. Earth, a planet light years away, inhabited by a species still in its technological infancy compared to Eloria. Yet within this distant world there was one human who held the key to their survival. A scientist named Ethan, whose research had inadvertently uncovered the principles that underpinned the universal energy system, principles that even the Elorians had struggled to fully grasp. But there was a problem. Ethan had kept his discovery a closely guarded secret, unwilling to share his findings with the rest of his species, let alone an alien civilization. Xenia had no doubt that he would refuse to assist her if she approached him directly. And with the clock ticking down to Eloria's collapse, there was no time for negotiation. I understand, Xenia replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil within her. I'll leave for Earth immediately. But, counselor, I'll have to take drastic measures. Ethan won't come willingly. The head counselor's expression was grave, but he nodded in understanding. Do what you must, Xenia. The fate of our world rests in your hands. The transmission ended, leaving Xenia alone with her thoughts. She knew the risks of what she was about to do, abducting a human from Earth, transporting him across the galaxy without his consent. It was an act that went against everything she believed in, everything her people stood for. But the alternative was unthinkable. Without Ethan's knowledge, Eloria would be lost. Steeling herself for the task ahead, Xenia made her way to the station's hangar, where a sleek, silver craft awaited her. The journey to Earth would be swift. Elorian technology made light-speed travel a reality, but the true challenge would begin once she arrived. She would have to find Ethan, subdue him without causing harm, and bring him back to Eloria before it was too late. As she boarded the craft, Xenia couldn't help but wonder how Ethan would react when he woke up on a foreign planet millions of miles from home. Fear? Anger? Betrayal? She knew she would have to be prepared for all of it. But she also knew that once Ethan understood the gravity of the situation, he would have no choice but to help. He was a scientist, after all, a man driven by curiosity, and the pursuit of knowledge. Surely he would see the logic in saving an entire civilization. The craft hummed to life as Xenia took her seat at the controls, the familiar sensation of weightlessness washing over her as she engaged the thrusters. The stars outside the viewport blurred into streaks of light as the ship accelerated to faster-than-light speeds, leaving Eloria behind in a flash. As the craft sped toward Earth, Xenia allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had always prided herself on her ability to solve even the most complex problems, to find solutions where others saw only obstacles. But this was something else entirely. She was about to cross a line that could not be uncrossed, to take actions that would forever change the course of not only her life, but the life of an innocent human. But what choice did she have? Eloria's survival depended on her, and she would do whatever it took to save her world, no matter the cost. The journey to Earth was brief, and before she knew it, Xenia's craft was entering the planet's atmosphere. She piloted the ship with expert precision, navigating through the thick clouds and turbulence, until she reached her destination, a remote research facility nestled in the mountains, far from the prying eyes of human civilization. Ethan's facility was small but well-equipped, a testament to his dedication to his work. Xenia hovered above the structure, scanning the area for any signs of life. The building was quiet, its lights dimmed for the night, but the heat signatures inside confirmed that Ethan was indeed present. Taking a deep breath, Xenia activated the ship's cloaking device and descended to the ground, the craft landing silently in a clearing just outside the facility. She quickly disembarked, her footsteps soundless on the soft earth as she approached the building. The door was locked, but that was no obstacle for Xenia. With a wave of her hand, she accessed the facility's security systems, bypassing the primitive safeguards with ease. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and Xenia slipped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. She moved through the dimly lit corridors, her senses heightened as she searched for her target. The facility was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of machinery in the distance. It wasn't long before she reached Ethan's quarters, a small, modest room filled with books, papers, and various pieces of scientific equipment. There, in the center of the room, sat Ethan, hunched over his desk, completely absorbed in his work. Xenia hesitated for a moment, watching him with a mixture of awe and regret. This was the man who held the key to her world's survival, the man she was about to abduct from his home and transport across the galaxy. But there was no time for second thoughts. The fate of Eloria hung in the balance, and Xenia knew what she had to do. With a silent apology, Xenia raised her hand, a small device clutched in her palm. A beam of light shot out from the device, enveloping Ethan in a gentle, sleep-inducing field. He had no time to react. His head slumped forward onto the desk, his breathing deep, and even as he slipped into unconsciousness. Xenia moved quickly, carefully lifting Ethan from his chair and carrying him back to the waiting craft. She strapped him into one of the passenger seats, ensuring that he would remain secure during the journey back to Eloria. As she took her seat at the controls, Xenia couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She had done what was necessary, but that didn't make it any easier. As the craft ascended into the sky, leaving Earth behind, Xenia glanced over at Ethan's unconscious form. "I'm sorry," she whispered, knowing that he couldn't hear her. "But I promise you, this is for the greater good." The stars blurred into streaks of light once more as the ship accelerated to faster-than-light speeds, hurtling toward Eloria. Xenia's mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead: the challenge of convincing Ethan to help, the race against time to save her world, and the weight of the decision she had made. But no matter how difficult the road ahead, Xenia knew one thing for certain: she would do whatever it took to save Eloria. And now, with Ethan by her side, she had a chance to turn the tide and ensure that her world would not be lost to the darkness. As the ship sped through the cosmos, carrying them both toward an uncertain future, Xenia could only hope that Ethan would understand, that he would see the necessity of their actions and join her in the fight to save Eloria. Because in the end, their fates were now intertwined, bound together by a shared mission, a mission to save a world on the brink of destruction. The sensation of weightlessness lingered as Ethan struggled to orient himself. His mind, still reeling from the abrupt and surreal transition, grappled with the reality of his surroundings. The metallic chamber around him was eerily silent, save for the soft hum of energy that seemed to pulse through the walls like a living heartbeat. This was no dream. It was all too real. Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps as he forced himself to stand. His legs felt unsteady, as if they belonged to someone else, and his heart pounded in his chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed in the quiet room. He reached out to steady himself, his fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface of the wall. The material felt strange, alien, yet it responded to his touch, sending a ripple of light across its surface, as if acknowledging his presence. "Where am I?" he whispered to no one in particular, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and disbelief. He had never felt so alone, so utterly out of his depth. Everything he had known, everything familiar, had been stripped away in an instant, leaving him adrift in a sea of the unknown. A soft chime sounded, breaking the silence. Ethan turned toward the source of the noise, his eyes widening as a portion of the wall slid open, revealing a corridor bathed in a pale blue light. The figure from earlier, Xania, stood there, her tall, graceful form backlit by the glow. She seemed almost ethereal, her silver-blue skin shimmering like liquid metal, her violet eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. "Ethan," she said, her voice carrying a calm authority that contrasted with the turmoil inside him. "You're safe here. I understand that this is overwhelming, but I need you to trust me." "Trust you?" Ethan's voice cracked with incredulity. "You abducted me from my home, brought me to. Where exactly? And you expect me to just trust you?" Xania stepped forward, her expression softening with something that looked almost like empathy. "I understand your anger, but you must believe me when I say I had no other choice. My world is on the brink of destruction. I had to act quickly." Ethan's mind raced, trying to process her words. Destruction? A world on the brink? The concepts were so far removed from anything he had ever imagined dealing with. He was a scientist, not a hero, not some savior of distant planets. But the look in Xania's eyes, an urgent, desperate plea, cut through his confusion. "Why me?" he asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with the first traces of understanding. "Why did you take me? What could I possibly do to help?" Xania hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "Because, Ethan, you hold the key to restoring our energy system, the very system that sustains life on Eloria. You discovered something, a principle of universal energy, that no one else in the galaxy has been able to understand. Without your knowledge, my people will die." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine as the enormity of her words settled over him. The memory of that discovery, years of studying quantum fields, pushing the boundaries of what was known, flashed through his mind. He had kept his findings to himself, unsure of their implications, and now it seemed those implications were far greater than he had ever imagined. "I didn't think it was that important," he said, almost to himself. "I was just exploring theories, trying to understand how energy works on a cosmic scale. I had no idea it could mean life or death for an entire planet." Xenia nodded, her gaze steady. "Your discovery has the potential to save millions of lives, Ethan. But time is running out, our energy system is failing, and once it collapses, there will be no way to reverse the damage." Ethan rubbed his temples, trying to push back the growing headache that threatened to overwhelm him. This was too much. The responsibility, the fear, the sheer impossibility of the situation, it was all too much. But as he looked at Xania, saw the sincerity in her eyes, he knew that turning his back on her people, was not an option. "What do you need me to do?" he asked finally, his voice resigned but resolute. Xania exhaled, relief washing over her features. "Thank you, Ethan. We need to analyze your findings, understand how you came to your conclusions, and apply that knowledge to stabilize our energy system. But first, you need to recover from the journey. The transition between our worlds can be disorienting." Ethan nodded numbly, realizing for the first time how exhausted he felt. His body ached, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, and all he wanted was to close his eyes and wake up back in his study, where everything was normal and safe. But that world was gone, at least for now. Xenia gestured for him to follow her, and with heavy steps, Ethan walked out of the chamber and into the corridor. The walls glowed softly, the light guiding their path as they moved deeper into the heart of the Elorian structure. Ethan glanced around, trying to take in as much as he could, but the alien architecture was like nothing he had ever seen, elegant yet functional, with smooth curves and seamless surfaces that seemed to defy the laws of physics. "Where are we?" he asked after a moment, the scientist in him craving knowledge, even in the midst of his turmoil. "We're on a station orbiting Eloria," Xenia replied. "It's a research facility where we've been monitoring the energy system. I thought it would be best to bring you here first, away from the chaos on the surface. Ethan felt a flicker of curiosity. What's happening on the surface? Xania's expression darkened. Our cities are experiencing widespread power failures. The energy fields that protect us from the harsh elements of our planet are weakening. People are frightened. They're starting to lose hope. The weight of her words settled heavily on Ethan's shoulders. He had never been responsible for anything on this scale, an entire civilization teetering on the edge of disaster. His scientific achievements, his carefully constructed life on Earth, seemed so small in comparison. As they walked, Xania continued to explain the situation. Aloria was a world of immense beauty and complexity, its energy system designed millennia ago by a civilization far more advanced than Earth's. The system harnessed the natural forces of the universe, cosmic radiation, gravitational fields, and other phenomena that humans had only begun to understand. But over time, the system had started to degrade, its ancient mechanisms failing under the strain of constant use. Ethan listened intently, absorbing the information even as his mind raced to connect the dots. The principles Xania described were familiar to him, echoing the very theories he had been exploring in his research. But where he had only scratched the surface, the Alorians had built an entire world around those principles, a world that was now crumbling. We've tried everything, Xania said, her voice tinged with frustration. But our technology is based on understanding that has become obsolete. We need a fresh perspective, someone who can see the problem from a new angle. That's where I come in, Ethan said, more to himself than to her. The realization was daunting. He wasn't just here to help, he was here because he was their last hope. They reached a small chamber, its walls lined with soft, glowing panels that emitted a soothing warmth. In the center of the room was a sleek, low bed made of some material Ethan couldn't identify. Xania gestured for him to lie down. You should rest, she said gently. The journey has taken a toll on you, and you'll need your strength for the work ahead. Ethan hesitated, his mind still racing, but he knew she was right. He was running on fumes, and if he was going to be of any use, he needed to recharge. He lay down on the bed, surprised at how comfortable it felt, almost as if it was adapting to his body. Xania moved to the door, pausing as she looked back at him. I'll be nearby if you need anything. We'll start working as soon as you're ready. Ethan nodded, closing his eyes as the door slid shut with a soft hiss. The room was quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the station's systems. Despite the whirlwind of emotions and thoughts swirling in his mind, exhaustion soon overtook him, pulling him down into a deep, dreamless sleep. When Ethan awoke, the first thing he noticed was the stillness. For a moment he forgot where he was, his brain trying to reconcile the unfamiliar surroundings with the memories of his abduction. But as he sat up, the events of the previous hours came rushing back, and he realized with a sinking feeling that this was no nightmare. He was still on the station, still far from home. The room was exactly as he had left it, the soft glow from the walls creating a calming atmosphere. He felt surprisingly refreshed, his body no longer aching, and his mind clearer than it had been since his arrival. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Okay, Ethan, he murmured to himself. You can do this. Just think of it as another problem to solve. A really big, world-ending problem, but still, just a problem. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up, feeling more stable than before. The door to his room slid open, as if responding to his movement, and he stepped out into the corridor, where Xania was waiting. Good morning, she said, her tone neutral but not unkind. I trust you slept well. Ethan nodded. As well as can be expected under the circumstances. Xania motioned for him to follow her, and they walked in silence for a few moments, the soft light of the station guiding their path. As they moved, Ethan noticed subtle details he had missed before, the way the walls seemed to pulse with energy, the faint, almost musical hum that filled the air, the strange symbols etched into the surfaces that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them. What are those? He asked, gesturing to the symbols. Xania glanced at them, a small smile playing on her lips. They're part of our language, but they're more than just words. They're dynamic, evolving with the energy of the station. They help us understand and interact with the technology on a deeper level. Ethan stared at the symbols, fascinated. He had always been intrigued by the idea of language as a living, evolving entity, but to see it manifested so literally was something entirely new. He wondered what it would be like to truly understand this language, to be able to read the energy patterns and communicate with the technology in such a seamless way. They reached a large room which Xenia identified as the central research hub. It was a vast, open space filled with consoles, holographic displays, and machines that hummed with power. In the center of the room was a large, translucent sphere that floated above the ground, its surface alive with swirling lights and patterns. "This is the core of our operations," Xenia explained, leading Ethan to one of the consoles. "The sphere you see is a simulation of our energy system, updated in real time with data from the planet. It's where we've been trying to identify the source of the failure." Ethan approached the sphere, his curiosity piqued. The patterns inside it shifted and flowed like a living organism, the lights pulsing in time with some unseen rhythm. He reached out to touch it, but Xenia gently caught his hand. "Careful," she warned. "The sphere is sensitive to energy fluctuations. It's not dangerous, but it can be unpredictable." Ethan withdrew his hand, nodding. "What have you learned so far?" Xenia sighed, her expression troubled. "We know that the system is deteriorating, but we haven't been able to pinpoint the exact cause. The system is incredibly complex, with layers of redundancy and safeguards that should have prevented this kind of failure. But something is disrupting those safeguards and we don't know what." Ethan studied the sphere, his mind racing as he tried to connect the dots. The principles he had discovered, the way energy flowed and interacted on a cosmic scale, could be the key to understanding the problem. But he needed more information, more data to work with. "Can you show me the system's architecture?" he asked. "I need to see how it's all connected, how the energy flows through it." Xenia nodded and moved to a console, her fingers dancing over the controls. The sphere in the center of the room changed, its surface shifting to reveal a complex web of lines and nodes, each one representing a part of the energy system. The web pulsed with light, the nodes glowing softly as energy flowed through them. Ethan stared at the display, his analytical mind kicking into high gear. The web was beautiful in its complexity, a perfect balance of form and function. But as he watched, he noticed something small, almost imperceptible fluctuations in the flow of energy, tiny disruptions that seemed to ripple through the system like waves on a pond. "There," he said, pointing to a section of the web where the fluctuations were most pronounced. "That's where the disruption is happening. It's subtle, but it's enough to cause instability." Xenia leaned closer, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the area he had indicated. "You're right. But why is it happening? What could be causing such a localized disturbance?" Ethan frowned, his mind working through the possibilities. It could be a number of things: an external force, a breakdown in the system's components, or even something environmental. We need to isolate the source and figure out what's causing it. Xenia nodded, her expression resolute. "Then let's get to work." And so they began. Over the next hours, perhaps days, though Ethan lost track of time, they delved deeper into the intricacies of the Elorian energy system. Ethan's knowledge of universal energy principles proved invaluable, allowing them to identify and understand patterns that had eluded the Elorian scientists. Xenia, in turn, provided insight into the ancient technology, guiding Ethan through the complexities of the system with her deep understanding of her world's history and science. Despite the pressure and the stakes, Ethan found himself enjoying the work. The challenge was immense, but it was the kind of intellectual puzzle he had always thrived on. And as they worked, a mutual respect began to form between him and Xenia. She was brilliant, determined, and tireless, qualities that Ethan couldn't help but admire. Xenia, for her part, began to see Ethan not just as the reluctant human she had forcibly brought to her world, but as a partner, someone whose unique perspective and skills were essential to their mission. She marveled at the way his mind worked, how he could see connections that others missed, and she found herself growing increasingly grateful that he had agreed to help, despite the circumstances. There were moments of tension, of course times when the data didn't make sense, when frustration threatened to boil over. But each time they found a way through it, their determination to save Eloria driving them forward. As the hours turned into days, Ethan began to feel a connection to this distant world and its people. He could see the desperation in Xenia's eyes, the weight of the responsibility she carried, and he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of duty to help her, to help them all. He knew that his life on Earth was a world away, but here in this place he was needed in a way he had never been before. And so, despite the uncertainty, despite the fear, Ethan kept going, driven by the knowledge that he might be the only one who could make a difference. As they neared what Xania believed could be the solution, they hit a roadblock. A piece of critical data was missing information that could only be obtained by traveling to the surface of Eloria, to one of the ancient power nodes that fed the energy system. "It's risky," Xania said, her tone grave as she explained the situation. "The power nodes are located in remote, harsh environments. The energy fields that once protected those areas are failing, and the conditions are deteriorating rapidly. But without that data, we can't complete the repairs." Ethan felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. The idea of venturing into the unknown, into a hostile environment on an alien planet, was terrifying. But the determination in Xenia's eyes, the unspoken plea for him to help, left him with little choice. "I'll go," he said, his voice firm, despite the fear gnawing at him. "We've come this far. I'm not backing out now." Xenia's eyes softened, a mixture of relief and gratitude washing over her features. "Thank you, Ethan. We'll go together. I won't ask you to face this alone." Ethan nodded, his resolve solidifying. This was more than just a scientific challenge now. It was a mission to save a world, to help a people he had come to care about, even if only through the bond he had formed with Xenia. As they prepared to embark on the journey to the surface, Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. The path was uncertain, fraught with danger, and the outcome was anything but guaranteed. But he knew, deep down, that he had made the right choice. He was no longer just a bystander, a victim of circumstance. He was a part of this world's fight for survival. And as he stood beside Xenia, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew that this was just the beginning of a journey that would change them both forever. The descent to Eloria's surface was unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced. Encased in the sleek confines of an Elorian transport vessel, he watched in awe as the planet unfolded beneath them. The once vibrant world, now shrouded in a haze of decay, stretched out like a wounded animal, its vast cities dimmed, its lush landscapes marred by the failing energy fields that had once protected them. As the vessel broke through the cloud layer, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The reality of Eloria's plight hit him harder than he had anticipated. The transport hummed softly as it navigated the atmosphere, its smooth, polished surface reflecting the muted light of Eloria's distant twin suns. Ethan sat in the co-pilot's seat, his hands gripping the armrests as he tried to steady his nerves. Xenia piloted the craft with a practiced ease, her violet eyes focused intently on the controls. Her face was a mask of determination, but Ethan could see the tension in her jaw, the slight tremor in her hands. She was just as anxious as he was, though she hid it well. "Are you sure this is safe?" Ethan asked, his voice betraying the anxiety he tried to keep in check. Xenia didn't look at him, her attention fixed on the readouts before her. "Safe isn't the right word. Necessary is more accurate. The power nodes are in one of the most remote regions of Eloria, and the energy fields there are deteriorating rapidly. We'll need to move quickly once we're on the ground." Ethan swallowed hard, the knot of anxiety in his stomach tightening. The thought of venturing into a hostile environment on an alien planet was terrifying, but the determination in Xenia's voice left no room for doubt. This was their only option. The transport began to decelerate, the hum of its engines shifting to a lower, more resonant frequency as they approached their destination. Through the cockpit's viewport, Ethan could see the landscape below, a desolate stretch of rocky terrain, dotted with the remnants of ancient structures that had once been the backbone of Eloria's energy system. The ruins were bathed in a pale, sickly light, the last vestiges of the energy fields flickering like dying embers. "We're almost there," Xenia said, her voice tight. "I'll set us down near the main power node. We'll need to access the control terminal to retrieve the data we need." Ethan nodded, his mouth dry. He had never felt so out of his element, so completely at the mercy of forces he barely understood. But he knew that this was the only way forward. If they could obtain the data from the power node, they might be able to stabilize the energy system and save Eloria. And if they couldn't? He pushed the thought from his mind, focusing instead on the task at hand. He had always prided himself on his ability to solve problems, to think logically and methodically in the face of challenges. This was just another problem to solve, he told himself, even if the stakes were higher than anything he had ever faced before. The transport touched down with a soft thud, its landing gear sinking into the loose gravel of the barren landscape. Xenia powered down the engines and turned to Ethan, her expression unreadable. "Are you ready?" she asked. Ethan took a deep breath, nodding. "As ready as I'll ever be." Xenia gave him a curt nod, then unbuckled her harness and stood. She moved to a compartment at the back of the cockpit, retrieving two sleek, metallic devices that looked like armbands. She handed one to Ethan. "These are energy shields," she explained. "They'll protect us from the worst of the environmental hazards, but they won't last forever. We'll need to be quick." Ethan slipped the armband over his wrist, feeling a slight tingle as it activated, forming a faint, shimmering barrier around his body. He glanced at Xenia, who had already activated her own shield and was moving toward the exit hatch. "Stay close to me," she said as the hatch opened with a hiss, releasing a rush of cold, acrid air into the cabin. "The power node is about 100 meters from here. We'll need to move fast." Ethan followed her out of the transport, the ground crunching beneath his boots as they stepped onto the desolate terrain. The air was thin and sharp, each breath burning his lungs, despite the shield's protection. He glanced around, taking in the bleak landscape, jagged rocks, crumbling structures, and the distant, shimmering remains of the once mighty energy fields. "This place feels dead," he muttered, more to himself than to Xenia. "It's dying," Xenia replied, her voice tight with urgency. "The energy system here was one of the first to fail. The degradation started here and spread outward, like a disease. If we can fix this node, we might be able to reverse the process." Ethan nodded, his determination hardening. He had come this far, he wasn't about to give up now. They moved quickly, their shields flickering as they passed through pockets of unstable energy. The power node loomed ahead, a massive structure of dark, weathered metal, its surface etched with the same shifting symbols Ethan had seen on the station. The structure pulsed faintly, its light dim and erratic, a dying heartbeat in the vast emptiness. Xenia led the way to a small access panel at the base of the node. She knelt beside it, her fingers deftly manipulating the controls. The panel hissed open, revealing a complex array of circuitry and conduits, all glowing faintly with the remaining energy that flowed through the node. "This is it," Xenia said, her voice tinged with both hope and fear. "I'll need to interface with the system to extract the data. It's going to take some time." Ethan knelt beside her, studying the intricate network of conduits and circuits. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Xenia glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "Just keep an eye out for any signs of instability. If the node starts to collapse, we'll need to get out of here fast." Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the area as Xenia worked. The silence around them was eerie, broken only by the occasional crackle of energy as the node struggled to maintain its integrity. Every so often, the ground beneath them would shudder, a reminder of the unstable forces at play. As Xenia continued to work, Ethan's mind wandered, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. He had been a scientist on Earth, content with his quiet life of research and discovery, never imagining that he would be thrust into a situation like this, an alien world, a dying planet, and the fate of millions resting on his shoulders. And then there was Xenia. The descent to Aeloria's surface was unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced. Encased in the sleek confines of an Aelorian transport vessel, he watched in awe as the planet unfolded beneath them. The once vibrant world, now shrouded in a haze of decay, stretched out like a wounded animal, its vast cities dimmed, its lush landscapes marred by the failing energy fields that had once protected them. As the vessel broke through the cloud layer, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The reality of Aeloria's plight hit him harder than he had anticipated. The transport hummed softly as it navigated the atmosphere, its smooth, polished surface reflecting the muted light of Aeloria's distant twin suns. Ethan sat in the co-pilot's seat, his hands gripping the armrests as he tried to steady his nerves. Xenia piloted the craft with a practiced ease, her violet eyes focused intently on the controls. Her face was a mask of determination, but Ethan could see the tension in her jaw, the slight tremor in her hands. She was just as anxious as he was, though she hid it well. "Are you sure this is safe?" Ethan asked, his voice betraying the anxiety he tried to keep in check. Xenia didn't look at him, her attention fixed on the readouts before her. Safe isn't the right word. Necessary is more accurate. The power nodes are in one of the most remote regions of Aeloria, and the energy fields there are deteriorating rapidly. We'll need to move quickly once we're on the ground. Ethan swallowed hard, the knot of anxiety in his stomach tightening. The thought of venturing into a hostile environment on an alien planet was terrifying, but the determination in Xenia's voice left no room for doubt. This was their only option. The transport began to decelerate, the hum of its engines shifting to a lower, more resonant frequency as they approached their destination. Through the cockpit's viewport, Ethan could see the landscape below, a desolate stretch of rocky terrain, dotted with the remnants of ancient structures that had once been the backbone of Eloria's energy system. The ruins were bathed in a pale, sickly light, the last vestiges of the energy fields flickering like dying embers. "We're almost there," Xenia said, her voice tight. "I'll set us down near the main power node. We'll need to access the control terminal to retrieve the data we need." Ethan nodded, his mouth dry. He had never felt so out of his element, so completely at the mercy of forces he barely understood. But he knew that this was the only way forward. If they could obtain the data from the power node, they might be able to stabilize the energy system and save Eloria. And if they couldn't? He pushed the thought from his mind, focusing instead on the task at hand. He had always prided himself on his ability to solve problems, to think logically and methodically in the face of challenges. This was just another problem to solve, he told himself, even if the stakes were higher than anything he had ever faced before. The transport touched down with a soft thud, its landing gear sinking into the loose gravel of the barren landscape. Xenia powered down the engines and turned to Ethan, her expression unreadable. "Are you ready?" she asked. Ethan took a deep breath, nodding. "As ready as I'll ever be." Xenia gave him a curt nod, then unbuckled her harness and stood. She moved to a compartment at the back of the cockpit, retrieving two sleek, metallic devices that looked like armbands. She handed one to Ethan. "These are energy shields," she explained. "They'll protect us from the worst of the environmental hazards, but they won't last forever. We'll need to be quick." Ethan slipped the armband over his wrist, feeling a slight tingle as it activated, forming a faint, shimmering barrier around his body. He glanced at Xenia, who had already activated her own shield, and was moving toward the exit hatch. "Stay close to me," she said as the hatch opened with a hiss, releasing a rush of cold, acrid air into the cabin. "The power node is about 100 meters from here. We'll need to move fast." Ethan followed her out of the transport, the ground crunching beneath his boots as they stepped onto the desolate terrain. The air was thin and sharp, each breath burning his lungs, despite the shield's protection. He glanced around, taking in the bleak landscape, jagged rocks, crumbling structures, and the distant, shimmering remains of the once mighty energy fields. "This place feels dead," he muttered, more to himself than to Xenia. "It's dying," Xenia replied, her voice tight with urgency. "The energy system here was one of the first to fail. The degradation started here and spread outward, like a disease. If we can fix this node, we might be able to reverse the process." Ethan nodded, his determination hardening. He had come this far, he wasn't about to give up now. They moved quickly, their shields flickering as they passed through pockets of unstable energy. The power node loomed ahead, a massive structure of dark, weathered metal, its surface etched with the same shifting symbols Ethan had seen on the station. The structure pulsed faintly, its light dim and erratic, a dying heartbeat in the vast emptiness. Xenia led the way to a small access panel at the base of the node. She knelt beside it, her fingers deftly manipulating the controls. The panel hissed open, revealing a complex array of circuitry and conduits, all glowing faintly with the remaining energy that flowed through the node. "This is it," Xenia said, her voice tinged with both hope and fear. "I'll need to interface with the system to extract the data. It's going to take some time." Ethan knelt beside her, studying the intricate network of conduits and circuits. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Xenia glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "Just keep an eye out for any signs of instability. If the node starts to collapse, we'll need to get out of here fast." Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the area as Xenia worked. The silence around them was eerie, broken only by the occasional crackle of energy as the node struggled to maintain its integrity. Every so often, the ground beneath them would shudder, a reminder of the unstable forces at play. As Xenia continued to work, Ethan's mind wandered, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. He had been a scientist on Earth, content with his quiet life of research and discovery, never imagining that he would be thrust into a situation like this, an alien world, a dying planet, and the fate of millions resting on his shoulders. And then there was Xenia. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, brilliant, determined, and utterly focused on saving her world. But there was more to her than just that. He had seen glimpses of vulnerability, moments when the weight of her responsibility threatened to crush her. She had taken an enormous risk in bringing him here, and despite his initial anger and fear, he couldn't help but feel a growing respect for her. But respect wasn't the only thing he felt. There was something else, something that tugged at the edges of his consciousness whenever he looked at her. A connection, perhaps, born of their shared struggle, or maybe something deeper, something that both intrigued and frightened him. He shook the thoughts from his mind, focusing instead on the task at hand. This was not the time for distractions. They needed to retrieve the data, stabilize the system, and get out of here before the node collapsed. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shuddered violently, and the air around them crackled with energy. Ethan's shield flickered, the barrier struggling to hold against the onslaught of unstable forces. "Xenia," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the energy surge. "What's happening?" Xenia's hands flew over the controls, her expression grim. "The node is destabilizing faster than I anticipated. I'm almost done, but we need to move." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the node pulse erratically, its light flickering like a dying flame. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and Ethan could feel the energy fields around them weakening, their protection waning with each passing second. "Hurry," he urged, glancing around for any sign of danger. The air was thick with tension, the very fabric of the environment straining under the pressure of the failing node. "I've got it," Xenia exclaimed, her voice filled with both relief and urgency. "The data is secure. We need to get back to the transport now." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He sprang to his feet, following Xenia as she bolted from the node, their shields flickering dangerously as they pushed through the unstable energy fields. The ground bucked and heaved beneath them, and Ethan could hear the distant sound of cracking rock and crumbling structures. They ran as fast as they could, the transport coming into view just as the node behind them let out a deafening crack, a burst of energy rippling through the air. Ethan felt the shockwave hit him like a physical blow, his shield flaring brightly as it absorbed the impact. "Get in," Xenia shouted, pushing him toward the transport as the ground split open behind them, sending jagged fissures racing toward them. Ethan scrambled into the transport, Xenia right behind him. The hatch sealed shut just as another shockwave rocked the vessel, the entire structure shuddering under the force of the blast. Xenia leapt into the pilot's seat, her fingers flying over the controls as the transport's engines roared to life. "Hold on," she warned, and with a jolt, the transport lifted off the ground, rocketing away from the collapsing node. Ethan held his breath as they ascended, the landscape below them dissolving into chaos as the energy fields finally gave way. The node erupted in a blinding flash of light, sending a shockwave through the air that rattled the transport, but Xenia held steady, her hands gripping the controls with white-knuckled determination. As they soared higher, the atmosphere around them began to stabilize, the chaotic energy gradually fading as they put distance between themselves and the collapsing node. Ethan exhaled a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his body trembling with adrenaline. Xenia glanced over at him, her expression one of weary relief. "We made it," she said, her voice hoarse from the strain. Ethan nodded, unable to find the words. He felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and something else he couldn't quite name. He had faced death, true, but more than that, he had felt the weight of his responsibility, the enormity of the task that still lay ahead. As the transport broke through the upper atmosphere, heading back to the orbiting station, Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. They had succeeded in retrieving the data, but the real challenge was yet to come. They would need to analyze the information, find a way to apply it to the failing energy system, and somehow stabilize the entire network before it was too late. He glanced at her, taking in the exhaustion etched on her face, the determination still burning in her eyes. She had risked everything to bring him here, to save her world, and despite the initial anger and fear he had felt, he couldn't help but feel a growing respect for her. She was a leader, a scientist, and more than that, a person who cared deeply about her people. As the station came into view, Ethan knew that their work was far from over. The data they had retrieved might hold the key to saving Eloria, but the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty and danger. They would need to work together, to trust each other, if they were to succeed. And as the transport docked with the station, Ethan made a silent vow to see this mission through to the end, to do whatever it took to save this world that was now as much his responsibility as it was Xenia's. The bond between them, forged in the crucible of crisis, was growing stronger, and Ethan knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. But as they prepared to disembark, a new thought crept into his mind, unbidden and unsettling. What would happen after? After they saved Eloria, if they saved Eloria, what would become of him, of Xania, of the connection that had begun to form between them? Ethan pushed the thought aside. There would be time for those questions later. For now, all that mattered was the mission. And so with a renewed sense of purpose, Ethan stepped off the transport, ready to face whatever came next, side by side with Xania. The station hummed softly as Ethan and Xania stepped off the transport, their footsteps echoing in the quiet corridors. The harsh, sterile light of the facility contrasted sharply with the chaotic energy of the surface they had just escaped. The air was cooler here, more controlled, but it did little to ease the tension that hung between them. They had succeeded in their mission, but the weight of what was still to come pressed heavily on their shoulders. Ethan walked beside Xania in silence, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The events on the surface had shaken him more than he cared to admit. The sheer force of the collapsing power node, the frantic rush to escape, the realization of how close they had come to disaster had all played over and over in his mind. But beneath the fear and the adrenaline, there was something else, an undeniable connection that had formed between him and Xania during their harrowing experience. As they moved deeper into the station, Ethan couldn't help but steal glances at Xania. She moved with a purposeful grace, her shoulders squared, her expression focused. Yet, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the toll that the mission had taken on her. She had been carrying the weight of her world's survival on her shoulders for so long, and now, with their success in retrieving the data, that weight had only increased. They entered the main research hub, the central command area where they had spent countless hours analyzing the failing energy system. The large, translucent sphere that simulated Eloria's energy network still hovered in the center of the room, its surface now glowing with renewed activity as the data they had retrieved began to integrate with the system. Xania moved to the console, her fingers deftly inputting commands, her focus intense. Ethan stood beside her, watching the data stream scroll across the holographic displays. He understood the importance of the work they were doing, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more they needed to address, something unspoken that lingered between them. Xania, he began, his voice hesitant. Can we talk? Really talk. Xania paused, her hands hovering over the console. She didn't look at him, but he could see the tension in her posture. There's still so much work to do, she said, her voice tight. We need to analyze this data, find a way to apply it. I know, Ethan interrupted gently, and we will. But right now I think we need to take a step back. We've been running on adrenaline, making decisions under immense pressure. I think we need to understand each other better if we're going to keep working together. Xania finally turned to face him, her violet eyes searching his. For a moment she seemed conflicted, as if weighing the merits of his suggestion against the urgency of their mission. But then, with a sigh, she nodded. All right, she said softly. We can talk. Ethan gestured to a small seating area at the edge of the room, away from the consoles and the constant hum of the machinery. It was a modest space, just a few chairs and a small table, but it offered a bit of separation from the overwhelming focus of their work. They walked over together, and Xania sank into one of the chairs with a weariness that belied her usual composure. Ethan sat across from her, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together as he tried to find the right words. He had always been a man of science, comfortable with numbers and theories, but when it came to emotions, to connecting with another person, he often found himself at a loss. You've been carrying this burden for a long time, he began, his voice gentle. I can see how much this means to you, saving your world, protecting your people. But I also see how much it's costing you. Xania looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the armrest of the chair. I don't have a choice, she said quietly. I'm one of the few who understands the energy system well enough to even attempt a solution. If I don't do this, if I don't succeed, then everything will be lost. Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her responsibility. But you don't have to do it alone, he said. I'm here now. We're in this together. Xania's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a moment her composed exterior cracked, revealing a glimpse of the fear and doubt that she had been holding back. I've always been alone in this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Even before the crisis began, I was different. My mind worked differently. I saw things others didn't, understood things they couldn't. It set me apart, made me feel isolated. Ethan felt a pang of empathy. He knew what it was like to feel isolated, to be consumed by ideas and theories that others couldn't comprehend. "I understand," he said. "In a way, I felt that too. My work on Earth discovering the principles of universal energy was something I did in isolation. I didn't share it with anyone because I didn't think they'd understand. And maybe I was afraid of what it could mean." Zinnia tilted her head slightly, her expression softening as she listened. "Why did you keep it a secret?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Why didn't you share it with your world?" Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words. "I suppose I was afraid of the implications. If I was right, it would mean that everything we thought we knew about energy, about the universe, was wrong, or at least incomplete. And I didn't know what that would mean for humanity, for our future. So I kept it to myself, waiting for the right time, if there ever was one." Zania nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "It's strange, isn't it, how knowledge can be both a gift and a curse. The more we understand, the more we realize how much we don't know and how dangerous that knowledge can be." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind turning over her words. "Yes, it is. But I think the real danger lies in what we choose to do with that knowledge. We can use it to help others, to make the world or the universe a better place. Or we can let it consume us, isolate us, until it becomes a burden too heavy to bear." Zinnia was silent for a moment, her eyes distant as she considered his words. "I've always believed that knowledge is power," she said finally, "but I never thought about the cost of that power. I never considered how it could isolate me, how it could make me feel so alone." "You're not alone anymore," Ethan said softly. "We're in this together. And I think we can help each other." Zania's gaze met his, and for the first time since they had met, Ethan saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, a vulnerability that she had been hiding behind her stoic exterior. "You're right," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been carrying this burden alone for so long that I forgot what it's like to have someone to share it with. But now, I don't want to do this alone anymore." Ethan reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The gesture was simple, but it conveyed more than words ever could. In that moment, a bond formed between them, a bond forged in the crucible of crisis, tempered by mutual respect and understanding. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their shared burden feeling just a little bit lighter. Ethan could feel the tension in his chest easing, replaced by a warmth that spread through him as he looked at Zinnia. He had come to Eloria as an unwilling participant, a reluctant hero thrust into a situation beyond his control. But now he felt a sense of purpose, a determination to see this mission through, not just for the sake of Eloria, but for the bond that had grown between him and Zania. "I don't know what the future holds," Zania said quietly, breaking the silence. "But I know that whatever happens, we'll face it together." Ethan squeezed her hand gently. "Together," he echoed. They remained like that for a while, drawing strength from each other's presence. The room around them hummed with the steady rhythm of the station's systems, the data they had retrieved from the surface slowly integrating into the energy network. But for the first time since their journey began, the tension between them had eased, replaced by a mutual understanding and trust. Finally, Zania released a small sigh and stood, pulling her hand away from his with a reluctant smile. "We should get back to work," she said, though her voice lacked the urgency it had held before. "There's still so much to do." Ethan nodded, rising to his feet. "Yes, but we'll do it together. And I think we'll be stronger for it." Zania's smile widened, the first genuine smile he had seen from her. "I believe you're right." They returned to the console, side by side, their previous distance replaced by a sense of camaraderie. The translucent sphere in the center of the room pulsed gently as the data continued to flow, and Ethan could see the subtle changes taking place within the energy network. The information they had retrieved was making a difference, stabilizing the system little by little. As they worked, Ethan found himself glancing at Zinnia more frequently, noting the way her expression softened whenever their eyes met, the way her voice seemed to lose its edge when she spoke to him. There was a connection between them now, a bond that went beyond their shared mission. It was something deeper, something that Ethan couldn't quite define but felt in every glance, every word. Hours passed in a blur of activity. They analyzed the data, applied it to the energy network, and monitored the results, watching as the system slowly but surely began to stabilize. There were setbacks, moments of frustration when the data didn't quite match up, or when the system resisted their attempts to correct it, but each time they worked through it together, their newfound understanding giving them the strength to push forward. As they neared the end of their task, the atmosphere in the room grew lighter, the tension that had gripped them for so long finally starting to fade. The energy network was responding, the fluctuations that had threatened to tear it apart now subsiding, the system stabilizing at last. "It's working," Xenia said, her voice filled with both relief and wonder. "The data we retrieved, it's making a difference. The system is stabilizing." Ethan felt a surge of triumph. "We did it," he said, unable to keep the smile from his face. "We actually did it." Xenia turned to him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "We couldn't have done it without you, Ethan. You've saved my world." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. The reality of what they had accomplished, the enormity of it, was almost too much to process. He had come to Eloria as a reluctant participant, but now, standing beside Xenia, he felt a deep sense of pride in what they had achieved together. "We saved your world," he corrected gently. "Together." Xenia smiled, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "Yes, together." They stood in silence for a moment, the gravity of their success settling over them. But even as they basked in the relief of their accomplishment, Ethan couldn't help but feel a twinge of uncertainty about what the future held. They had saved Eloria, but what would happen next? What would become of their bond, of the connection that had grown between them? "Xenia," he began, his voice hesitant. "What happens now? I mean, after this, what happens to us?" Xenia's smile faded slightly, replaced by a thoughtful expression. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've been so focused on saving Eloria that I haven't thought about what comes after. But I do know that I don't want to go back to being alone." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Neither do I," he said quietly. "But I also don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I can stay here, on Eloria. And I don't know if I want to go back to Earth, either." Xenia's gaze softened. "We'll figure it out," she said. "Together." Ethan nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time he wasn't afraid of it. He had found something here on Eloria, something he hadn't known he was missing. And whatever the future held, he knew that, as long as he and Xenia faced it together, they would be okay. As they stood there, side by side, the energy network glowing softly around them, Ethan realized that the mission had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had come to Eloria as a reluctant hero, but now he felt a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose that he hadn't known was possible. And as he looked at Xenia, he knew that he had found something even more valuable. He had found someone who understood him, who shared his burden, and who had become an integral part of his life. The mission to save Eloria was over, but a new journey was just beginning. A journey that he and Xenia would take together wherever it might lead. And for the first time, Ethan felt truly ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead.